Welcome to the channel. Today's story tells of an enslaved boy so small he was forced to clean chimneys sent into walls no child should ever enter. What he discovered inside those narrow dark passages would alter lives, expose a hidden truth, and change everything that followed. This is a difficult and intense story. So take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're re-listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. There is a photograph that survives from 1859. It shows a child standing beside a brick chimney in Charleston, South Carolina. The boy's skin is covered in soot so thick that his features are barely visible. His eyes, however, cut through the darkness like 2 points of light in an endless night. He cannot be older than 8. His knees are wrapped in rags soaked with blood. His elbows show bone, and he is smiling. Not a smile of joy, but the smile of someone who knows something that you do not. That boy's name was Elijah. And within 3 years of that photograph being taken, he would bring down one of the most powerful families in the American South. This is his story. Before we can understand what Elijah found inside those walls, we need to understand the world that created him. In the decade before the American Civil War, Charleston was the wealthiest city in the South. Cotton and rice had made its white citizens obscenely rich. By 1857, the city contained more millionaires per capita than any other place in America. The grand houses along Meeting Street and Lagar Street were monuments to this wealth. They rose 3 and 4 stories high, with elaborate facades and towering chimneys that required constant maintenance. And it was these chimneys that created the demand for children like Elijah. The practice of using small children to clean chimneys was not unique to America. It had been common in England for over a century. But, in the American South, the practice took on a particularly brutal dimension. Enslaved children were preferred because they could be forced into the most dangerous chimneys without complaint. They could be worked until they died and then simply replaced. The average lifespan of a chimney sweep in Charleston was 22 years. For enslaved children who began the work young, it was considerably less. The soot that coated their lungs led to a condition called chimney sweep's cancer. It killed slowly and painfully, but that was years away. The immediate dangers were more pressing. Burns from still hot flue, falls from rooftops, getting stuck in narrow passages, and suffocating to death. In 1846, a Charleston newspaper reported that 3 enslaved children had died in chimneys in a single month. The article expressed concern not for the children, but for the inconvenience caused to homeowners. Elijah was born sometime around 1849 on a small rice plantation outside of Georgetown, South Carolina. His mother's name was Sarah. She worked in the fields planting and harvesting rice in the flooded patties. That made Georgetown the wealthiest rice-producing region in the world. Elijah's father was unknown, at least officially, but the other enslaved people on the plantation whispered that he was the son of the overseer, a white man named Thomas Calhoun, who was known for his cruelty. This made Elijah's skin lighter than his mother's, though not light enough to pass for white. It also made him a source of shame for the overseer, who could not look at the boy without seeing his own transgression. When Elijah was 5 years old, Thomas Calhoun sold him to a traveling slave trader for $37. It was less than the price of a good hunting dog. Sarah tried to stop them. She threw herself at the men who came to take her son, clawing at their faces, screaming words that witnesses would remember decades later. They beat her with a horsewhip until she could no longer stand. The last thing Elijah saw as the wagon pulled away was his mother lying in the dirt, still reaching toward him with one hand. he would spend the rest of his life trying to find his way back to her. The slave trader's name was Marcus Webb. He operated out of a compound in Charleston where enslaved people were held before being sold at auction. Webb had a reputation for specializing in children. Operated out of a compound in Charleston where enslaved people were held before being sold at auction. Webb had a reputation for specializing in children. He sold them to factories, to plantation owners who wanted house servants, and increasingly to the men who ran chimney sweeping operations. When Webb saw Elijah, he immediately recognized the boy's value. He was small for his age, wiry, and most importantly, light enough to fit into the narrowest chimneys. Within a week, Elijah had been sold again, this time to a man named Jeremiah Cobb. Cobb was what they called a master sweep. He owned no chimneys himself. Instead, he owned children. At any given time, Cobb had between 8 and 12 enslaved boys who he rented out to wealthy homeowners throughout Charleston. The boys lived in a shed behind Cobb's house on the outskirts of the city. They slept on bare wooden boards, ate cornmeal mush twice a day, and began work before dawn. Cobb had learned the chimney trade in London before immigrating to America in 1832. He had brought with him all the brutal efficiency of the English system adapted for the particular cruelties of American slavery. The training began immediately. Elijah was stripped naked and forced to climb a practice chimney that Cobb had built behind his house. The bricks had been deliberately roughened with a metal file to simulate the texture of real chimneys. Elijah's skin tore on his first ascent. Cobb stood below, poking at the boy's feet with a long pole whenever he stopped moving. By the end of the first day, Elijah's knees and elbows were raw and bleeding. By the end of the first week, they had begun to callous. By the end of the first month, the calluses were thick enough that Elijah could climb without bleeding. This was called hardening. It was the process by which a child's body was transformed into a tool. But Elijah was learning more than how to climb. He was learning how to survive. The older boys in Cobb's shed taught him the secrets of the trade. They taught him how to angle his body to avoid getting stuck in narrow passages. They taught him how to breathe through a wet rag to filter out the worst of the soot. They taught him how to recognize the sounds of a house, to know when people were approaching to become invisible. And most importantly, they taught him how to listen. The chimneys of Charleston were not just passages for smoke, they were networks of whispered secrets running through the walls of every wealthy home in the city. Sound traveled through these passages in strange ways. A conversation in a bedroom might be heard clearly by someone climbing a chimney 3 rooms away. The enslaved children who cleaned these chimneys learned to listen carefully. The information they gathered was their only currency, their only power in a world that gave them none. In the heart of the sweltering cotton fields, where hope often felt as distant as the northern star, lived a young boy named Elijah. His world was one of sun-scorched days and whispered stories in the dark, a life bound by chains he could see and others he could only feel. But Elijah had a secret, a flicker of light in his world of shadows. He knew how to read. It was a dangerous gift, one taught to him in stolen moments by his mother before she was taken away. She had always said, "Words are maps, baby. They can lead you to freedom." Now, those words were all he had left of her. One sweltering afternoon, while cleaning out the old smokehouse, a place filled with the ghosts of cured hams and forgotten things, his fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. Curiosity, a dangerous but persistent friend, urged him to pry it open. Beneath it lay a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. His heart hammered against his ribs as he unwrapped it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in a steady, elegant hand. They weren't addressed to anyone he knew, and the ink was faded with age. As dusk settled, Elijah smuggled the letters back to the cramped quarters he shared with several other families. By the flickering light of a single tallow candle, he began to decipher the strange words. They spoke of conductors and stations, of parcels being delivered safely to Canaan. It was a code, a language of liberation that hummed with a secret promise. The letters were a map, just like his mother had said. But it was a map he couldn't read alone. He knew he needed help. There was only one person he could trust with a secret of this magnitude, Mama Ruth. She was the matriarch of their small community, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations and whose spirit was as unyielding as the ancient oak tree she often sat under. Her hands had delivered babies, mended clothes, and healed wounds, but it was her quiet strength that held them all together. Approaching her felt like approaching a queen. The next evening, under the cloak of a moonless sky, Elijah found Mama Ruth sitting on her porch, weaving a sweetgrass basket. His hands trembled as he held out the bundle of letters. He explained, his voice a hushed whisper, where he had found them and what he thought they meant. Mama Ruth stopped her weaving. She took the letters from him, her gaze sharp and discerning as she looked from the pages to his earnest face. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick with the chirping of crickets and the weight of unspoken history. Finally, she looked up, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. "You have your mother's eyes," she said softly, "and her fire." She then began to tell him a story, not of the distant past, but of the present, of a secret network that moved like a river in the dead of night. The letters, she explained, were the work of her own son, Thomas, a man Elijah had only known as the quiet blacksmith who had run off years ago. He wasn't just a runaway. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The smokehouse had been his secret post office. Mama Ruth explained the code. Conductors were the guides. Stations were safe houses. Parcels were people, souls yearning for freedom. Each letter was a report, a confirmation that a family had made it another step closer to the promised land of the North. Thomas, her Thomas, was out there, risking everything to lead others out of the darkness. The discovery wasn't just a collection of old papers. It was a living, breathing testament to courage and resistance. A new purpose ignited within Elijah. He wasn't just a boy in a field anymore. He was the keeper of a sacred trust. Under Mama Ruth's guidance, he began to learn more than just the words. He learned the rhythm of the railroad. He learned to read the stars, to mimic bird calls as signals, and to spot the subtle signs that marked a safe path. The coded letters were no longer a mystery. They were his textbook. He started helping Mama Ruth, using his small size to move unseen, delivering messages and food to those hiding and waiting for their chance to flee. He would receive new letters, sometimes tucked into the hollow of a tree or left under a specific stone by the creek. These were from Thomas, filled with new codes and instructions. Elijah would read them to Mama Ruth, his voice steady and clear, and together they would orchestrate the next steps. He was the eyes and ears, the vital link between the station and the conductor. He saw families disappear into the night, their faces a mixture of terror and hope, and he would pray for their safe passage, knowing he had played a small part in their journey. One day, a letter arrived that was different. It was addressed not to the network, but to Mama Ruth, and at the bottom, in a hand he now knew as well as his own, Thomas had written a simple message for him. "Elijah, it's time. Be ready." Freedom was no longer a dream whispered in the dark or a word on a faded page. It was a destination, and his map was finally leading him home. The night of his departure was heavy with a coming storm. Mama Ruth held him close, pressing a small bag of dried food and a newly woven sweetgrass token into his hand. "Your mother would be so proud," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Never forget where you come from, but never stop moving toward where you're meant to be. Be brave, little bird. It's time for you to fly." Elijah slipped into the woods, his heart a drumbeat of fear and exhilaration. He followed the signs he had memorized, the path illuminated by flashes of lightning. He was no longer just carrying the stories of others. He was writing his own. He was a parcel, a passenger, a traveler on the midnight road to freedom. He looked back one last time at the world he was leaving, a world of chains and sorrow, and then turned his face toward the north, toward the promise of a new dawn. The journey ahead was long and perilous, but, for the first time in his life, Elijah felt truly, completely, and gloriously free. Thank you for watching. The story of Elijah is a reminder of the incredible power of knowledge, community, and the unquenchable human spirit. If you were moved by this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of courage and hope. See you next time. In the heart of salt-stained London, where the sky was a permanent shade of grey, lived a boy named Elijah. At 12, he was already a veteran of the rooftops, a master of the narrow, winding flues that snaked through the city's grand houses. He was a chimney sweep, small for his age, a trait that made him invaluable to his master. A gruff man named Silas. One crisp autumn morning, Silas pointed to a towering, ornate chimney atop a mansion in a part of town Elijah had never dared to venture. "This one's a beast," he'd grunted. "Been blocked for years. They say it's cursed, but the pay is good. Be quick about it." Elijah, armed with his brushes and a heart full of trepidation, began his ascent. The chimney was old, its brickwork crumbling. As he squeezed into the opening, a wave of cold air, colder than any autumn breeze, washed over him. The flue was tighter than he'd expected, a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the light from above. He worked his way down, his brushes scraping against layers of thick, sticky creosote. It was slow, arduous work. His knuckles were raw, and soot filled his lungs with every breath. He felt a strange vibration in the walls, a low hum that seemed to resonate deep within the stone. Halfway down, his hand brushed against something that wasn't brick or soot. It was a loose stone. Curiosity, a dangerous luxury for a chimney sweep, got the better of him. He wiggled the stone, prying it with his sore fingers until it came free, revealing a small, dark cavity within the chimney wall. His heart hammered against his ribs. Reaching inside, his fingers closed around a small, oilskin-wrapped package. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. Stuffing it into his worn jacket, he replaced the stone and finished the job as quickly as he could, the strange hum seemingly growing louder in his ears. Back on the ground, filthy and exhausted, he handed the day's meager earnings to Silas, keeping his discovery a secret. That night, in the cramped, cold attic he called home, he unwrapped the package by the light of a single flickering candle. Inside was a small, leather-bound book and a peculiar, star-shaped metal object that felt warm to the touch. The book was filled with symbols he didn't recognize, an elegant, looping script. He couldn't read the words, but as his fingers traced the star-shaped object, the symbols in the book seemed to glow with a faint blue light. The next day, Elijah felt different. The world seemed sharper, colors more vibrant. As he swept another chimney, he noticed things he'd never seen before, spider weaving an impossibly intricate web, the subtle patterns in the brickwork, the way the wind whispered secrets as it swirled around the rooftops. That evening, he opened the book again. This time, as he held the star, a single word from the page seemed to lift itself into his mind. Ignis. He whispered it, and the candle flame beside him leaped and danced, growing into a brilliant, warm ball of light that hovered in the air. He gasped, stumbling backward. This wasn't a curse. It was magic. Over the next few weeks, Elijah secretly practiced in the dead of night. He learned words for mending, for moving small objects, for creating light and warmth. The book and the star were his teachers. He used his newfound abilities in small ways, mending a tear in his jacket, warming his cold attic room, even subtly clearing a stubborn blockage in a chimney without his brushes. He felt a sense of power and purpose he'd never known. But his secret life couldn't stay hidden forever. One afternoon, while sweeping a chimney in a wealthy merchant's house, he overheard a conversation. Two men in fine coats were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They spoke of a lost artifact, an astral key, stolen years ago from a secret society. They described it as a star-shaped object, the key to unlocking a book of immense power. Elijah's blood ran cold. The men mentioned they were close, that their own magical means had tracked its recent use to this very district. They were hunting for him. Panic seized him. He scrambled out of the chimney, his mind racing. He was just a boy, a chimney sweep. What could he do against powerful men who wielded the same kind of energy he was just beginning to understand? He ran, not back to Silas, but through the labyrinthine alleys of London, the astral key feeling like a lead weight in his pocket. He had to disappear. He spent the night huddled in a forgotten corner of a dockside warehouse, the book clutched to his chest. He was alone, hunted, and terrified. But as he looked at the book, he realized something. It hadn't just given him power, it had shown him a world beyond soot and servitude. He couldn't go back. The next morning, he made a decision. He wouldn't run. The book held knowledge, and knowledge was power. He needed to understand what he possessed, and why these men wanted it so badly. He spent days poring over the book, not just learning spells, but studying the diagrams, the star charts, the intricate history woven into its pages. He learned that the astral key and the book were tools of the luminaries, an ancient order dedicated to protecting the balance between the mundane and magical worlds. The men hunting him were likely from a splinter group, the Shadow Syndicate, who sought to use that power for control and conquest. He knew a direct confrontation would be foolish. He was a novice, a child. He needed a plan. Using his skills as a chimney sweep, he navigated the city's hidden pathways, the rooftops, the sewer tunnels, the secret passages within old buildings. He became a ghost, moving unseen. He used his magic subtly, creating diversions, misdirecting his pursuers with illusions of light and whispers on the wind. He was no longer just a chimney sweep. He was a guardian of his own life, a student of an ancient art. His pursuers were relentless. One evening, they cornered him in an old, abandoned bell tower. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their faces grim. "The boy has been clever," one of them sneered, a dark energy crackling around his fingertips. "Give us the key and the grimoire, and we will grant you a quick end." Elijah's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. He held the astral key aloft. He had been practicing one particular set of symbols, a complex sequence for defense. He shouted the words, pouring all of his fear and determination into them. A blinding shield of golden light erupted from the key, pushing the men back. The shield wouldn't last forever. He had to think. Looking up, he saw the massive bronze bell hanging directly above them. An idea, reckless and desperate, formed in his mind. He focused, whispering a word of motion, a word of force, pushing his energy not at the men, but at the ancient, weathered rope holding the bell. The rope groaned, then snapped. The men looked up in horror as the colossal bell plunged downward. They dove out of the way just as it crashed to the stone floor with a deafening boom that shook the entire tower. In the ensuing chaos and dust, Elijah vanished. He slipped out a side window and scurried down the wall, like a spider, disappearing into the London night. He had won the battle, but he knew the war was far from over. The Shadow Syndicate would not give up so easily. But as he ran, a new feeling replaced his fear: resolve. He was no longer just Elijah, the chimney sweep. He was a keeper of secrets, a wielder of magic. The rooftops of London were his domain, and he would protect his newfound legacy. From the shadows, he would learn, he would grow, and he would be ready for whatever came next.